The Dark Ages was a horrible time to be alive, and we're continuing it with a part 2 list, whether it was medieval torture devices or just the horrible state of living. We have it all on today's top 10 list. Coming in at number 10 we have the saw. Yeah, this was one of the most brutal ways that they would dispense out pain during the Dark Ages. Let me play out the whole scene for you. You get arrested for something serious, and now they want information out of you, and they are going to do this in the most painful way possible. So they drag you into a dungeon. You would be butt naked, and just for added effect, imagine that it's cold. Then they would tie a rope to each one of your legs and then hoist you up so that you're upside down with your legs spread apart and you're nude. Now comes the most horrifying part of the whole thing. You remember that massive saw that people would use to cut down trees? Those things that would take 2 men pushing back and forth to cut through a big old oak tree? Yeah, one of those would be used to slice you in half from the butt to your head. Easily one of the most painful ways that you could go. The wild thing about the saw is that it wasn't originally made for trees and then used on people. It's the other way around. People's obsession with being sadistic is what caused this all to happen. Coming in at number 9 we have Saint Edmund. Back in the Dark Ages it must have been really hard to make friends. It would seem that anytime you ran into a person you had to worry about if they were going to kill or rob you. You could never trust anyone, but Saint Edmund had a different way of looking at things. When the Vikings were invading England, he thought that he could show them the right way and thought that he could convert them to his religion, and then from there they would be great buddies and they would hang out and talk about life and all the good stuff. Well, it turns out that the Vikings weren't as understanding as he thought. The Vikings attacked Saint Edmund, they tied him to a tree and then fired arrows at him. Then they cut off his head and threw it into a forest. That's not funny, but for some reason it's just because he was like, I'm gonna convert these people, and they're like, actually we're gonna cut your head off. That's actually what's gonna happen. They weren't really nice about it. This was obviously a huge insult because back then if you weren't given a proper burial then people thought bad things would happen. And I don't know if you guys have read up on this, but cutting a guy's head off and throwing it into a forest isn't really a proper burial. Coming in at number 8 we have the rack. If you thought things couldn't get any worse, well let me tell you that they definitely can. Probably the thing that did best in the Dark Ages was finding more and more ways to inflict pain onto the body of a person in a slow and painful way. It's like everyone just sat around all day daydreaming about devices that would rip your body apart. And at one point someone came up with the rack. Think of a big wooden slab that has ropes on the top and bottom of it. These ropes are attached to cranks. They would be tied to your hands and feet, and then you would be stretched until your bones and joints and limbs start to pull apart. I can imagine that for the first few cranks it would feel pretty good. Like you would relax your whole body and just let it pull on your limbs. It would be like getting a good stretch. Like maybe this thing was actually built for a good cause. Maybe some dude was just like, I want to get a good stretch in, and he was the original chiropractor. But then some evil king saw this and the guy was like, well that would be extremely painful, but why would you want to do this? This is only for making people feel good. And the king then had the guy killed and then stole his idea. That would have been how it all went down, I'm sure. I'm a great historian. Coming in at number 7 we have no pleasure during procreation. Now some of you watching know all about the hanky panky, and some of you might not, but regardless you probably know that people do it for fun more than they do it to make a baby. That's why we have invented things like condoms, because making a baby is only fun when you really want to, and you shouldn't have to worry about knocking boots and making a baby that you don't want. Back in the Dark Ages there was a law that you were not allowed to get down and dirty unless it was for the purpose of having a kid, and you weren't allowed to experience any pleasure when you were hooking up, even if it was for the purpose of having a kid. This was because of something that God said, I think. I don't know who came up with this law, but this is a dumb one. That's like telling someone to eat food but they're not allowed to taste anything. The good thing about this is that this time period is dead and you don't need to worry about going to jail because you had fun with your partner. Coming in at number 6 we have the Pear of Anguish. Now I had to throw this one on the list because the name sounds amazing. Like it's a pear of anguish. That sounds like a fruit you bite into that has a worm in it and you sulk around for the rest of the day because you got grossed out. But it turns out that this pear was way more brutal than that. The Pear of Anguish was something that kind of looked like a big metal pickle, and it had a screw on the end of it. Now what it would be used for was punishing people for various reasons, but this is how it would be used. It would either be pushed into the mouth or the bum of a person, and then the pickle end that was inside your body would start to expand, and the thing probably wouldn't even kill you. It would just feel horrible and leave you crippled. old. You probably would get an infection and pass away from something later. Coming in at number 5, we have how long you gonna live. Right now, you can hope to live until you're an old fart. You can putter around your whole life and maybe come out to the other side as a little old dude who goes to Denny's and sits in the corner by himself and drinks coffee and thinks about how he's all alone in the world as time passes him by. You could be that one day if you're lucky. But back in the Dark Ages, there was no way that you would be able to make it to that age. If you lived that long, you would probably be accused of being a witch and then taken somewhere to be burned at the stake. Back then, the average age that a man would live was somewhere around 31. I'm 28 right now. Could you imagine that? I would already be near the end of my life. Man, there's still so much I want to do. I've never even been to Disney World. How could I die before I spent $20 on a hot dog and then threw up that hot dog on some kid's head while I was on a roller coaster? But if I was born in the Dark Ages, I wouldn't be able to live much longer to go to Disneyland. That's why it was called the Dark Ages back then. You wouldn't even get to go to Disneyland. Coming in at number 4, we have the coffin cage. Man, they had endless ways of making your life horrible back in the day. Maybe if they focused on making people feel good, there wouldn't have been so much violence. I'm just kidding. Back then, humans were brutal creatures, and if you were nice to others, it probably would have led to you being on the bad end of these punishments. Like when the dude got his head cut off and then thrown into the forest. See, he tried to be nice, but that's what happens. Back then, you had to be ruthless if you were someone who got caught for a crime and people didn't want to kill you, but they wanted you to be imprisoned and on display for the whole world to abuse. They might put you in a caged coffin. Basically, think of a bird cage that is so tight you can't move. So it's hugged around your body like a coffin, but everyone can see inside of there. Then they would hang you up somewhere where everyone could see you, and anyone could come through and shame you or abuse you while you were stuck inside that cage. It would combine shame and torture in a way that's almost impressive. Coming in at number 3, we have servitude to the king. Some people think that back in the Dark Ages, you could just find a house in the countryside and then just live out there without any problems. You would grow your grain and then have your own cattle, and that would be your life, living off the land and working with your hands. Well, that was not the case at all, unless you were able to hide, which would be hard to do because you would need to start a fire to cook some meat, so people patrolling the countryside would see all that smoke coming off of your little home. But if anyone knew where you were, you would have to pay tax to the king, which would be a ton of what you were bringing in. In some cases, they would take the majority. Sometimes you even had to go to the king if you wanted to even get married. Think about that, if you had to ask the president or the prime minister for permission to get married. But when you look at how taxes are taxed right now and how little income you actually get to keep, things don't really seem that different, do they? And how did they solve this problem? Well, that was through massive revolution. I'm not saying we should have a revolution, I'm just saying it might lower taxes. And coming at number 2, we have the head crusher. Now, this horrible tool didn't have as inventive as a name as the Pear of Anguish, but trust me, it was one of the worst things on this list. So what the head crusher is doing is exactly what you think that it would be doing, which is crushing your head. Your head would be placed on a wooden plank, and then a metal cap would be put on the top of your head. The cap would then be cranked down and turned onto your head, and the force would be crushed onto your head until your head exploded. Yeah, unlike the rack where maybe you could make the argument that it made people feel good for a moment, I don't think you could convince anyone that this thing was created for anything other than nefarious purposes. So I would have to say that I think this one was only used for horrible things. How could you even be the person who turned the crank? You would have to watch a dude's head literally explode. That's disgusting. Coming in at number 1, we have life was unstable. There was really nothing you on back then. One year you might have a massive famine which led to not enough food to go around, and then war would break out and there would be blood running in the streets. Or you could get a greedy evil king that would get into power, which would lead to civil unrest and there would be blood running through the streets. There might even be an invading country which would lead to a massive war and blood running in the streets. There might have been a new religion in power that would force you to change your beliefs, and some people would push back again, which would lead to blood running in the streets. So basically the world was constantly trying to kill you back then. Alright guys, that has been our list. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and hit the little notification bell. Until next time, I've been your host, Jay Dorena. That was something that was, this was something that was kind of but when you look at how taxes, but when you look